Segment 24A, Introduction. Welcome to the Cold War, the epic non-contest pitting the United States and its allies against the USSR and its allies for control of the whole world. As opposed to previous world wars, the principal competitors, the United States and the USSR, did not actually fight. They relied on propaganda, proxy wars, diplomatic tricks, and an arms race which bankrupted one nation and nearly bankrupted the other. Because both sides possessed nuclear arms and the ability to deliver them anywhere in the world, it was assumed that if one power nuked another, the other would retaliate. This was called MAD, or MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. The whole world could literally go up in flames any time. Each side, of course, portrayed the other side as the evil empire. For people of my generation, it was generally assumed that this arrangement of East and West would go on forever. Segment 24B, The Iron Curtain Descends, covers what Russians still call the Great Patriotic War. Not to downplay the sacrifices made by the United States and the other Western allies, but the Soviet Union bore by far the brunt of the suffering. As many as 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians were killed, millions more injured, all to go along with the damage to their country's infrastructure. The USSR believed that its sacrifices entitled them to turn Eastern Europe into a network of client states. Not to be outdone, the United States and its allies took steps to ensure Western Europe's security, including the Marshall Plan and NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Segment 24C, Communism to the World, takes us east, specifically to China, where the Chinese Civil War of 1945 to 1949 was a great big proxy war, thanks to American support of Chiang Kai-shek and Soviet support of Mao Zedong. When it ended in all but total victory for the communists, Chiang ran off to Taiwan. The United States was alarmed, rightly so. When the North Koreans invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, the response of the United Nations was conditioned by the United States. The United Nations mounted a quick offensive which drove the North Koreans back to the Chinese border by October. At this point, October 1950, Red Chinese troops rushed in over the border, bringing the war into a bloody stalemate, which was put on hold and never officially ended by a ceasefire signed in July 1953. Meanwhile, in Vietnam, the Viet Minh, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, succeeded in kicking the French out in 1954. As in Korea, a communist North faced off against a Western-supported South. Unlike the two Koreas, who still remain at some kind of peace, both Vietnams were on a collision course with each other. In segment 24D, Khrushchev's USSR, we meet the peasant's son who wound up ruling the largest country in the world. Compared with his predecessor Stalin, Soviets and foreigners alike saw Nikita Khrushchev as a breath of fresh air. Coming to power in fall 1953, Khrushchev wanted to improve living conditions for the Soviet masses. But this goal still took second place to pursuing the Soviet Union's traditional goals: military superiority and exporting communism. The arms race with the West, already very expensive, became even more costly as it expanded to include a space race. The Soviets' bungled foreign policy was also costly and dangerous. Cuba in particular was a bad investment. The combination between domestic and international mistakes was enough to sink Khrushchev in 1964. Segment 24B, The Iron Curtain Descends. After the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, Stalin realized that victory would require total commitment. For that reason, Stalin learned to quickly present the war as a great patriotic war against the Axis, minus the third member of the Axis, Japan. As Stalin and the Communist Party now put it, the men and women fighting the war were not so much the builders of Marx's workers' paradise as they were the sons and daughters of Mother Russia, the sons and daughters of Dmitry Donskoy and General Suvorov, saving Mother Russia from yet another Western invader. That they did, but at a terrible cost. From 1941 to the summer of 1943, the Germans fought their way deep into the Soviet Union, leaving behind a terrible path of destruction and outright genocide, murder of Jews, Ukrainians, and anybody they didn't like. But the Soviets began pushing back. By early May 1945, the Soviets had captured Berlin. Germany, shortly after, surrendered. The U.S. and Great Britain had fought hard against Germany, especially after the June 1944 invasion of Normandy. The United States had also, all by itself, borne the brunt of the war against Japan, including development of the atomic bomb. And the U.S. had provided the Soviet Union with much military aid. Still, the Soviet Union had fought the hardest and suffered the most, including the Soviets' brief role in the war against the Japanese. At the very end, the Soviet casualty list was more than 25 million military and civilian dead. Some have said the number is closer to 27 million. In the United States, which fought on two separate fronts, both far from home, this war has always been called World War II. In the Soviet Union and in Russia today, it has always been called the Great Patriotic War. When the war ended in the Pacific and all was said and done, Western and Soviet soldiers alike came home. In the United States, war was followed by 5 years of peace and by prosperity. The people of the Soviet Union were not as lucky. Immediate prosperity was not likely, given the horrible wreckage caused by the war. Still, the Soviet people hoped at least for an end to the long work days and awful working conditions that they had endured the last 4 years. But to Stalin, the Great Patriotic War was yet another means to an end. Just another battle, another chapter in the great struggle between communism and capitalism. For Stalin, the war never ended. It merely passed to a different phase. The Soviet Union's new priorities were to rebuild from the Great Patriotic War, to export communism to the world, and to ensure the long-term stability of the Soviet Union. These last two priorities required a huge military and the ability to deploy nuclear bombs. The third and most important priority also required creating a wall of client states between the USSR and the West. Not 30 years after the Bolsheviks had knocked down the Russian Empire, the Soviets began building an Eastern European empire of their own. Of course, the Soviets themselves portrayed it as a Pax Sovietica, imposed upon these people for their own good. But in effect, the Soviets were just gathering the lands, just like even Moneybags had started to do 6 centuries earlier. At the Soviet bloc's high point, The USSR's client states included Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, Albania, and East Germany. Each of these countries was forced into the Soviet bloc by violent means. Even during the war, Stalin practiced ethnic cleansing upon Soviet nations he considered unreliable. He was no nicer to the Eastern Europeans. The Soviets also tried to reel in their communist brethren in Yugoslavia, but the Yugoslavian leader, Marshal Tito, was able to keep himself from being a mere client. The Soviet bloc lay behind what Winston Churchill aptly called the Iron Curtain. Yet the West could only watch as communism spread everywhere the Red Army had defeated the Nazi Germans. The biggest quarrel took place over Germany itself, which the West saw as an important part of restoring Europe. But to the Russians, Germany was an ancient enemy to be punished and exploited. Both sides had a valid argument. So Germany was divided into eastern and western halves, each of which formed a government favoring its patron. To complicate the situation, the German capital of Berlin lay deep within the communist part of Germany, but itself was divided into eastern and western sections controlled by the eastern and western powers, as you can see on the map. With the Axis defeated, both East and West talked about the continuing of their friendly relationships, and they both worked to the creation of the United Nations. Yet, the Western powers no longer felt a need to stay friends with the Soviets, and began taking stronger steps to hold on to those areas which had been spared Soviet liberation, like Greece and Turkey. On March 12, 1947, President Harry S. Truman declared his intent to give Greece and Turkey all the military and financial aid necessary to keep them out of the Soviet sphere of influence. This announcement became known as the Truman Doctrine. Both the West and the East competed for influence in the Western European nations. In 1948, the U.S. introduced the Marshall Plan, which provided generous financial credits to European countries, which were in turn used to buy goods from the United States. This was a virtual win-win situation. The Western European economies rebounded rapidly, which ensured political stability and won the United States a great deal of goodwill. The Soviets, too, spent lavishly on bankrolling the Western communist parties, especially in Italy and France. Yet the Soviets, who insisted on micromanaging the world's communist parties, found it was tougher to impose Moscow's will on free Westerners than it was on Eastern European subjects. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, came into being, joining the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, and other countries to defend against attack from an unnamed nation, which was undoubtedly the Soviet Union. To counter NATO, the Soviet Union created in 1955 the Warsaw Pact, which ratified an already assumed commitment to defend its client states from any attack. In this way, the Western and Eastern blocs became actual political entities, with everybody else left into a kind of third world. Segment 24C, Communism to the World. In the Far East, the Soviets and the Red Chinese cooperated to spread the world revolution. In China, Mao Zedong's communists were in a bloody three-cornered war with the Japanese and the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. When the Soviets finally did join the war against Japan in 1945, They captured large piles of Japanese weapons, which they gave to the Red Chinese. The Japanese surrender later that year allowed Mao and Chiang to focus on the Chinese Civil War. The Chinese Civil War, which lasted from 1945 to 1949, became a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviets had always dreamt of a Red China, which would supposedly take orders from Moscow. The United States felt that a Red China, added to the Eastern European client states of the Soviet Union, would be a double disaster. So, the U.S. spent a great deal of money propping up Chiang Kai-shek. The Soviets spent a great deal of money propping up Mao Zedong. Mao won. In hindsight, the nationalists of Chiang Kai-shek were just too brutal and too corrupt to rule a country China's size. Mao and his Red Chinese were just as brutal, but like their Soviet advisors, they had the advantages of strong leadership, disciplined followers, and clear objectives. In Peking on October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong proclaimed the People's Republic of China. On December 10, 1949, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan, where it continues to this day. Yet Red China never became the client state that Stalin had hoped for. From the start, the Chinese showed an independent streak, suiting a nation so much older than Russia. Mao paid lip service to Stalin as the leader of world communism, but he was hard at work at building a Chinese form of communism for Chinese realities. A homegrown communist movement had also sprung up in Korea. After the Japanese surrender, Korea was divided along the 38th parallel into a communist north and a democratic south. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung and South Korean President Syngman Rhee both wanted to lead a united Korea, but the North struck first. Neither Stalin nor Mao was interested in a proxy war with the West. They were afraid it might go nuclear, as it almost did. But Kim Il-sung was persistent, and he launched a surprise attack on South Korea June 25, 1950. Soon the South Koreans and the small American force were driven nearly back into the sea. President Harry S. Truman had just watched China fall to the communists. He could not afford to watch Korea fall also. Truman adhered to the so-called domino theory, which compared the spread of communism to a string of dominoes falling at nearly lightning speed. First China falls, then South Korea falls, then South Vietnam falls. You get the picture. Truman decided on a quote-unquote police action to stop communist momentum. The UN Security Council hurriedly met and decided to send in a UN, not US, peacekeeping force. The Soviet UN ambassador could have vetoed this resolution had he not been boycotting the meeting out of anger about China. As leader of the United Nations force, Truman named General Douglas MacArthur, formerly the effective proconsul of Japan. Under MacArthur, UN forces drove the North Koreans almost all the way back to the Red Chinese border. Scared by the presence of Western troops on their border, Red China sent nearly 300,000 soldiers across the border in October 1950. Soon, the UN forces were retreating for their life back to the 38th parallel. When General MacArthur tried to dictate U.S. strategy in the area, including the carpet bombing with nuclear weapons, President Truman fired him. By January 1951, a bloody stalemate had developed right along the border originally set for the two Koreas, the 38th parallel. A ceasefire was signed on July 27, 1953, 4 months after Stalin's death. But no peace treaty has been signed to this day. The Korean War, thankfully, was the first limited war, a proxy war which did not, again, thank God, escalate into a world war. Elsewhere in the Far East, the French Empire was crumbling fast. The center of power in the world had shifted from Europe to a straight line between Moscow and Washington. But France, like Britain and the Netherlands, hated to give up its imperial prestige so quickly. Sadly, France was so battered from the Second World War and the First World War that it could maintain only a small army. Even so, the French would not give up Vietnam without a fight. They poured men and materials into an endless battle against the nationalist Viet Minh movement led by Ho Chi Minh. When the French finally realized that their cause and their empire were lost, the warring parties signed the Geneva Accord on July 21, 1954. The Geneva Accord partitioned Vietnam into North and South zones. Supposedly, they would be united as a result of free parliamentary presidential elections. Fearing with good reason that Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh would have won the elections, the South Vietnamese refused, with U.S. support, to ratify the Geneva Accord. Hostilities didn't break out at once. Both Ho Chi Minh and the South Vietnamese president Ngo Dinh Diem wanted to consolidate their own power bases. While Ho Chi Minh tightened the screws on the North Vietnamese economy, Diem accepted millions and millions of dollars in U.S. aid to prop up his regime for the final showdown. In December 1960, the National Liberation Front, so-called, was established in South Vietnam by order of Ho Chi Minh. Disguised as a non-partisan opposition group, the Viet Cong, as this organization is better known, was really the spearhead of North Vietnam's effort to conquer the South. The resulting Vietnam War became the focal point for the battle between the Western and Eastern blocs. Segment 24D, Khrushchev's USSR. Iosif Stalin died unexpectedly on March 5, 1953. His cult of personality was so pervasive that people literally stampeded to death paying their last respects to him. There had been no arrangements for a successor. Once the dust settled, the Soviet Union was led by a group of Stalin's old cronies headed by Nikita Khrushchev. During Khrushchev's time at the helm, which lasted until 1964, life in the Soviet Union was much less harsh than it had been under Stalin. Khrushchev instigated no purges. Production of consumer goods was increased, and apartment buildings began to sprout up instead of factories. The USSR also made well-meaning attempts to mend fences with communist rivals in Yugoslavia and Red China. The sudden end to the bloody stalemate in Korea just after Stalin's death was no accident. But for all the friendly public relations initiatives, Khrushchev's USSR was still welded to the old Stalinist goals of military superiority and fostering world revolution. For all of his bluster, Khrushchev himself was a dangerous foe who believed implicitly in the triumph of communism. He believed it would happen in 1980. Once the USSR had built its first nuclear bomb and blew it up in 1949, The arms race boiled down to developing more effective means of delivering the deadly goods. The U.S. and its allies originally favored long-range bombers, while the Soviets experimented with rockets. For a wealthy country like the U.S., which came out of World War II with a booming economy, the arms race was still a hideously expensive luxury. For the USSR, still reeling from the Great Patriotic War, the nuclear arms race canceled out Khrushchev's early emphasis on consumer goods. As long as the Soviet people thought the communist workers' paradise was on the horizon, maybe even by 1980, they could accept military spending as a means to this end. And through the middle 1950s, the Soviet Union's prestige remained high. Spurred on by Khrushchev's secret speech exposing Stalin's cult of personality and his crimes, the Communist Party of Hungary tried desperately to create a true, democratic, multi-party government. Fearing that the contagion of democracy might be spreading to other client states, and this is the domino theory again, the USSR intervened powerfully and brutally. Directed by the young Soviet ambassador Yuri Andropov, we'll see him again, Soviet tanks smashed the Hungarian Revolution to bits. Soviet national pride took a quantum leap in 1957 when Sputnik, the world's first space satellite, was sent into orbit. It looked like the Soviets had completely closed the technology gap with the US. As a result, the space race was now added to the already expensive East-West arms race. Costly in resources as it was, the Soviet people were genuinely and tremendously proud that they had gotten into outer space first. The Soviet Union also spent a great deal of time, effort, and money supporting foreign communist parties and revolutionary movements in the so-called Third World. Although individual American communists had helped their Soviet masters, mostly as spies, the American Communist Party as a political movement was an utter joke, harmless. Even in those Western European countries where communism did appeal to workers, some workers, the communist parties were more of a nuisance than a danger. To complicate matters, relations with the USSR's relations with Tito's Yugoslavia remained rocky, and the Red Chinese, angered by the disrespect of Stalin, go figure, began picking fights with the USSR. Dimly recognizing there was a problem, the Soviets tried to support African and South American quote-unquote Third World revolutionaries and courted so-called non-aligned nations in the Mideast. This, too, was an unwise investment of scarce resources. The revolutionaries the Soviets supported were only moderately successful, and the successful revolutionaries turned ungrateful. The only solid Soviet supporter gained during these times was Cuba. And even the Soviets didn't support Castro's 1959 revolution so much as they bought Castro's support after the revolution succeeded. Given the West's solid support of Israel, the Soviets hoped to buy friends in the Arab world. They sold mass quantities of weapons to the Arab nations at bargain prices. And they even built the magnificent Aswan High Dam over the Nile in modern Egypt. All they got for their troubles was kicked out. But every time the Israelis and Arabs fought, yes, another set of East-West proxy wars, the Arabs took a licking. Worse, the Arabs blamed the Soviet weapons and their Soviet advisors rather than blaming themselves. All in all, the Soviet foreign policy under Khrushchev was a disaster. Khrushchev's downfall came for both internal and external reasons. The Soviet people quit believing his promises of an impending communist paradise sometime around 1980. They were sick and tired of the Soviet reality. Crowded houses, lousy wages, waiting in long lines for bad food and shoddy consumer goods, and absolutely no hope of bettering their personal lot in life. Khrushchev had also alienated the Soviet Communist Party with his dumb economic schemes and his tendency to set up his own cult of personality. What likely sealed Khrushchev's fate was his erratic conduct during the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Khrushchev first sent the nuclear missiles to Cuba, but President John F. Kennedy forced him to take them back. Khrushchev's willingness to blink likely saved the world from the Third World War. But the Soviet military saw Khrushchev's backing down as an act of weakness. Throw in a couple years' worth of disastrous harvests, and the time was right for Khrushchev to leave. In October 1964, Khrushchev was deposed in a bloodless revolt by his humble lackey, the illustrious Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. But Khrushchev was not killed or even packed off to the Gulag. To the extent that politics was no longer a blood sport, the Soviet Union actually had improved. Segment 24E, Conclusions. 1. Winning the peace. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin all fought over the peace which followed the Second World War. There's no doubt now that Roosevelt and Churchill trusted Stalin more than they should have trusted him. But the Western Allies' inability to launch a major Second Front effort against Germany until June 1944 meant that the Soviets were stuck with doing most of the fighting and dying. This fact reduced the amount of leverage that Roosevelt and Churchill could use on Stalin at the February 1945 Yalta Conference. It reduced also the leverage their replacements, Truman and Attlee, could use at the July 1945 Potsdam Conference. Though both the Eastern Europeans and the many Americans believed that the West was hoodwinked into letting the Soviets create their network of East European client states, the truth is that the Red Army already occupied these territories. Thanks in large part to the Truman Doctrine, the West was in fact lucky to save Finland, Turkey, and Greece. 2. De-Stalinizing Russia. Stalin's domination of the Soviet Union and his cult of personality took a long time to fade from the Soviet consciousness. To this day, 2007, there are Russians who wish Stalin could come back. Khrushchev realized he had to end the rule by a virtual God king. He made himself personally more accessible to the Soviet public than Stalin ever was, and in his 1956 secret speech, Khrushchev exposed Stalin as the murderous, dictatorial thug he was, even though Khrushchev himself was one of Stalin's right-hand men. Khrushchev's efforts yielded unpredictable results. The Hungarian Communist Party, for example, took this de-Stalinization movement as a signal that they could start decommunizing their state. The Red Army resented Khrushchev because Stalin had always taken care of the Soviet military, and they didn't like his expenses on consumer goods. Finally, in the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party of Mao Zedong condemned Khrushchev's revisionism and his deviation from what they saw as the true path of communism. Although Mao Zedong did not like Stalin, he virtually loathed Khrushchev. Besides, Mao ruled in the same style as Stalin, basically, complete with cult of personality. It's not surprising that Mao took criticism of Stalin personally. 3. Russia and China. Russia and China have been at odds since the first Russian explorers made it through to the Pacific Ocean in the late 1600s. In the 20th century, the Soviet-Chinese relationship was complicated by Stalin's lukewarm support for Mao Zedong in the 1920s. But as a Russian, Stalin had no desire to have China as an enemy, and he had no guarantee that Mao would effectively defeat Chiang Kai-shek. When Mao assumed power in 1949, he was not close with Stalin, and his favorite term for Khrushchev was a psalm-singing old priest, which has got to be the worst thing one communist can call another. The Chinese had no love for Stalin, but their love of tradition made them angry about de-Stalinizing the USSR. They started to fear that the Soviets would side with the United States against them. Of course, the Soviets feared that the Chinese would side with the United States against them, especially after President Nixon reached out to the Chinese in 1971. 4. The Red Peril. For at least the first half of the Cold War, it was easy to see communism getting the upper hand in the world. China went communist in 1949. The Korean War of 1950 to 1953 was a draw, but a very bloody one. In suppressing the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the Soviet Union showed its stern resolve not to lose ground. In the United States, there was an unfortunate but understandable movement to root out communist agents, which descended at some points into a virtual witch hunt. The British government at this time was in fact riddled with secret communists. But this had to do more with the British higher education system and the upper-class students' passion for being trendy. Another consequence of the Cold War was the rush to spend money on the arms race. The cost of the arms race would help bankrupt the Soviet Union, but it also posed dangers to the United States. As President Dwight D. Eisenhower, formerly General Dwight D. Eisenhower, observed in his January 1961 farewell address, and this is a quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." How true. Eep.
You seen Huawei Fight?
Not yet.
Good.
Why is that?
Oh, that they go through Eisenhower's thing and all that, how he talks about the government can't ever have or make the military a corporation and profit. Anyway, it just shows exactly what happened.
Well, I know, and the thing is that Eisenhower was not only a general, but he was a Republican president.
Right.
He picked fucking Nixon to be his vice president, and he saw it. He saw it coming.
All coming, yeah. Yeah, they used him a lot in the documentary.
Well, I'm giving him his props here. I mean, I've got a fucking agenda. I just keep it very well hid. I had
That's pretty obvious to me.
Well, I mean, yeah, if you're smart, you know. But, well, fuck it. Fuck it. Okay, and for this next one, I will get you a graphic of me being a little bitty baby for you to lead off with.
Sounds good.
Okay? Phlegm and mucus. On August, I forgot. Segment 25A, Introduction. On August 13, 1961, as a month-old baby boy snoozed contentedly in Racine, Wisconsin, that's me, the East German government started work on the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall eventually became 9 feet tall, covered with barbed wire, searchlights and guns, and guarded by dogs and elite policemen. It was not constructed to keep envious West Berliners out of the socialist paradise called East Germany. Rather, it was built to keep East Germans and other Soviet bloc inhabitants from trickling into West Berlin, and from West Berlin into freedom. West Berliners were isolated. The West was suitably outraged. President Kennedy himself appeared in Berlin and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner." A Berliner, by the way, is Berlin slang for some kind of jelly roll donut. But in fact, the wall did communism more harm than it did good. More than any other thing, the wall symbolized the moral bankruptcy and outright tyranny prevailing in the Soviet Union and its client states. When the wall came down in 1989, it was a clear sign of the end for the USSR, which in fact survived the Berlin Wall by just 2 years. In segment 25B, Homo Sovieticus, we encountered the Homo Sovieticus, or New Soviet Man, which it was fondly believed communism would ultimately produce. In fact, years of depredation and propaganda and anti-intellectualism had made the Soviet populace even too apathetic to be cynical. Russian science, once the envy of all Europe, had been devoted to strictly military purposes for so long that the intelligentsia had basically gone into hibernation. That is to say, the lucky ones who avoided the Gulag and the psychiatric hospitals. In segment 25C, Gerontocracy, we trace the era of Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev, a man whose bluff, pleasant personality disguised a tiny, alcohol-sodden brain. A perfect nonentity, he did what he could to let the Soviet Union slip down into a mass of apathetic despair. Brezhnev was not himself, as some believed, always old and senile. He was merely in his late 50s when Khrushchev was deposed in 1964. Brezhnev's handling of the Czechoslovakian Prague Spring of 1968 was vigorous, but eventually he came to exemplify the notion of gerontocracy, rule, and this is a definition, rule by extremely old men. Brezhnev was already likely senile when Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan in December of '79. His aged successors, Andropov and Chernenko, were unable to get the troops out of Afghanistan or do anything to save the fast-declining Soviet state. Segment 25D, Fall of the Soviet Empire, gives us the end of the USSR as we know it. It fell apart. The republics all ultimately seceded, using a right granted by them by none other than Vladimir Ilyich Lenin himself when the Soviet Union was founded. Isn't it ironic? In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev inherited a regime with a stagnant economy, massive and expensive military commitments, a corrupt, top-heavy bureaucracy, and a populace that no longer cared about anything. By introducing perestroika, or restructuring, to the economy, and glasnost, or openness, to political life, Gorbachev hoped to jolt the Soviet Union back on the path towards communism, and it didn't work.